Oh, that's our webinar recording. So we've got the absolute privilege to have Brent Sutton with us today. Now, I've known Brent for quite a wee while. We've sort of overlapped in our work quite a bit. Normally, I see Brent in airport lounges because he seems to be traveling a lot, or fancy conferences, which is where he seems to hang around as well. But when he's not sitting in airport lounges and doing fancy conferences, he does assure me that he does real work. So I'll hand over to Brent and he can introduce himself and then maybe talk about his work, and then we'll get into the webinar. So Brent, off we go.
Hey, thanks, John, and look forward to seeing you at the next fancy airport lounge. Welcome everyone, guys. I'm Brent Sutton from Learning Teams Inc. Yeah, I just want to say to begin with, I'm not an expert in anything. Okay, I'm just an avid practitioner in trying to create change and safety. And I've published 5 books now on Amazon with people like Todd Conklin and Rob Fisher and a few others, where we explore the background to human organizational performance. But more importantly, things like learning teams, the 4 Ds, and learning from everyday work. And like all these things, we need to keep changing safety. And my colleague, Brian,
Oh, well, that's a shame. I don't know whether that's for everybody, but certainly Brent appears to have...
We need to create the shift productive safety.
Brent,
and a lot of people that learning type. Okay, if I come back.
Brent, I think the internet connection maybe at your end hung a bit. So if you just sort of rewind a couple of sentences and...
Sure, I might, if things get bad, I'll click onto my 5G. But just retouching that, I'm not an expert, I'm a practitioner. But I've written a series of books around things like HOP, learning teams, the 4 Ds, and learning from everyday work, because I want the wider community to adopt this. And that's what it's all about. And a lot of the language that we use, and particularly from my colleague, Diana Chan, is we want to shift the conversation from preventative safety to productive safety. This whole notion that if we have good operations, safety is an outcome of good operations. And particularly now that risks are changing, I mean, if we look at all the language that talked around, say, psychosocial design work, we're exposing people to physical risks, we're exposing them to chronic risks, and we're exposing them to psychosocial risks. We're a big fan of not treating them differently. We're a huge fan of treating them as a whole. And that can always be seen in the actual work that people do. Because in the world of HOP, work equals risk. We don't treat it as a separate thing. So let's kick off, and I'll share my slides. And if there's any problems, John, I'll go onto 5G if it...
Okay, no dramas.
So introduction to operational learning, guys. This always fascinates me because, when things go wrong, we find out that our people weren't perfect. We find out that our tools, resources, and conditions weren't perfect. We find that our systems of work weren't perfect, our rules weren't perfect, and our controls weren't perfect. But here's the question for you. When things go right, is it because those 5 things are perfect? And I would challenge you that they're not. That the same things that you find when work has gone wrong, those same things can be found while work is going right. And the only difference between that is that energy was able to be transferred to the worker. But a lot of things about variation or adaptation or all the other language we use, that's happening all the time. So what we talk about, and I love Homer Simpson because he's a classic pinup of safety. We talk about the fact that your best people on their best day are adapting. And they're adapting to the design and the conditions of the work. And what we want you to explore is to understand what that design and conditions of work actually looks like. But we can't do that without dealing with some myths. So when we think about operational learning, you guys have heard about things like work as imagined or work as done. In HOP, we talk about black line, blue line, and red line. So black line is how the organization believe work should be done. The blue line is how workers are having to perform that work. And you can see there that the red line is about the presence of energy. And when that blue line dips below the black line, that means that the work or the hazard is coming closer together. But also when the work is above the black line, it means that there's been some adaptation or change in that work. For example, you could have a work design that says 2 people need to lift it, but actual normal work, it requires 3 people. When we think about safety, we think about risk. The stuff that sits below the black line, that's really the threat component. But the stuff that sits above the black line, that's the opportunity component. And it's understanding that gap between work as imagined and normal work is what helps us to better understand that. But what's holding us back from that? Because it seems quite hard. Most of safety has been built on the absence or presence of harm. When in actual fact, what we're about is operational learning comes from problem with understanding that is our view of human error. And I love this slide because in many cases, if you look at your system, in one corner, we're putting your safety systems with all your lovely SOPs, your regs, your fail safes, your checklists, your golden rules. And in the other corner, we've got Dave. And when Dave gets it wrong, we always move to blame and punishment. But when Dave's not getting it wrong, we don't understand what's actually happening for why things are going right. So maybe in the chat box, if you like, it's really useful to understand your view of human error. So 2 questions for you. Do you view error as an action or an outcome? Do you view error as a cause or a consequence? Now, I'm running a no blame webinar, so I'm not going to judge you. It's really interesting for you to think about your own belief and to think about whether you treat error as an action or an outcome or as a cause or a consequence. So let's see if we can get that into the chat box or the Q&A, whatever people want to share.
And Brent, I still think your internet connection might be just crackling a little bit, so it might be worth if you can.
I will switch across to.
While you're doing that, we're definitely getting not naming names here, but we've got error is an outcome, error is a consequence. Got error is a consequence. I see it as an outcome. Error equals outcome consequence. So there's a theme. Yeah, outcome and consequence. Outcome. So broadly, what we're seeing is that people aren't really seeing error as action or cause on the call. I'm trying to see if I can find somebody that says that. Somebody interestingly suggested that maybe there can be any of these and depend upon circumstances. Somebody says action as it's something happening. Somebody else says human error is an outcome and a consequence of human interaction. So yeah, not a lot of variety in the responses, Brent. Like most people are thinking that outcome and action. And yeah, we've had one comment that says it depends.
It depends. Okay. All right. And these are, because that's important to have that belief, because in this world of human organizational performance, we basically look at it from an operational point of view, that error is an outcome or a consequence. Because if it was an action, it'd have to be intentional. and that would mean the person would be making an active choice. But deeper, say, John, from a systems point of view, we would say that error is a symptom of a system as well. And that's a whole system lens that HOP brings to the table in that space. So I'll just go and do my share again. That would have dropped out.
Just to throw in the mix, Brent, is that when I think about this concept of human error, I mean, it's certainly a term that I try to avoid because it has the connotations, right? That somehow like it's a choice or that it's a bad thing or something, you know, we should always try and avoid. And I think in thinking about that and reading about that, for me, I kind of just, instead of maybe talking about error, we just talk about that it's part of normal human performance. It's just what we do. It's part of being
absolutely 100%. In actual fact, the error is what makes us things go right a lot of the time. So we learn through that process. What HOP talks about is it doesn't want error to happen when humans are closest to the energy. And what HOP explores that we create error traps or error likely situations in the system, because error itself, error is not a disease or illness I can cure you of. Error is part of us as being human. So on my code there, these are some common human error myths. And these, John, these have actually come from the new Z10 ANSI standard out of the US for operational learning. So they're actually coming out now saying we need to shift our view on error, which is really exciting from a standards body to actually make that leap to do that. And I love the one in particular that training will solve human error, or experience eliminates error. All those things that we hang on to.
Brent, I must be very resistant to training then, because I've had lots of training and still make mistakes constantly, probably too many.
But you learn from it. That's the whole objective. So what we want to explore is that people will make mistakes. So here's an example, guys. Okay? Here's an example of making a mistake. One of those tubes is minty. One of those tubes isn't minty. Okay? One's for your mouth, one's for your ass. Okay? When will you know you got it wrong? Okay? Either taste or blowing bubbles. That's when you find out. And these are what we call error traps. And I was working with a group a few weeks ago, and one of the lovely ladies, she said, that happened to me yesterday. I went to grab my dry shampoo to spray, and it was deodorant. Okay, so we call these things error traps. And I just want to share with you that these traps exist in a lot of the work that we actually do. So what we're asking you to think about, we're asking you to think that knowing errors will happen is actually a good thing. Errors are not choices. They only look like that in retrospect, which is what hindsight drives. And if you can't remove error, then you must defend against it. And you've got to you have to build systems that allow it to be error tolerant. And if you think about it, things like isolation controls and engineering controls do exactly that. They work at a deeper level of the human, so that there's no thinking involved, they're more based on actions. So if we put barriers between a mobile plant and workers on foot, people won't walk into the barrier. That's the whole idea. It's working at a much deeper level for them. So the HOP lens of human error is simple. And of course, everyone loves the energy wheel at the moment, John. It's such a popular thing. So what HOP's saying is that we need to allow workers to fail safely, which means we either we're trying to prevent energy transferring to a human, or the work can fail gracefully. What does that mean? that means that we're limiting the amount of energy that gets transferred to the human if our defenses fail. And those are the two principles of it that sit around that. But here's the other thing I'm going to ask you to think about. I agree with John. The notion of human error is quite negative. It has been weaponized over time. It's seen as something that is bad. So maybe we should shift the lens between human error versus human reliability. So you can either reduce human error or you can increase human reliability. You can choose what you want. So for that, what does the audience want reliability to be? How high do you want people to be reliable? Maybe we can chuck a few things in the chat box. Do you want it to be 80%, 90, 95, 100? I'm sure there'll be some out there 110% because they're more than perfect.
I got an interesting comment in the Q&A, Brent, is somebody, there's the saying that the only things in life that are certain are death and taxes.
Correct.
So somebody's added human error to that list.
Yep, 100%. So maybe what I can share is the fact that nuclear energy, where HOP comes from, targets 99.5% reliability rate. That's their target, not 100%. Now, here's Homer. Everyone knows that Homer works at the Springfield nuclear power plant. And Homer has 3 jobs. He operates the control panel, he eats donuts, and he drinks Duff beer. Okay, he does 3 things. And every day, Homer performs 4 critical functions, or what we call critical actions. And if those actions aren't performed correctly, they have the potential to lead to a negative outcome. So over a month, Homer performs 100 critical actions. So at 99.5% reliability, over 100 critical actions, what do people think the error rate is? This is the scary part.
That's less than 1 mistake, isn't it?
So what if I shared with you it's 39%? Because it's degrading, because it's 0.905 times 0.905 to 100. So in nuclear, they simply acknowledge that error is present. And they acknowledge that a human cannot work at 100%. They acknowledge that humans will perform differently on an hourly basis, let alone a daily basis. So what they focus on is identifying what are those critical actions. They call them critical steps. And they look into the system to find those things that allow error to become present. So their focus is on improving reliability. And we're going to show you some ways of doing that because I think that's really important. So learning from normal work, we're going to introduce the 4 Ds to you. Some of you would have heard the 4 Ds. It's perfectly fine. Once again, I'll be very clear. We have made the 4 Ds available for non-commercial use, and we've made it available both under what we call attribution and no derivative, which means you can't change the 4 Ds. You have to live with the 4 Ds, but it's freely available to anyone to use for non-commercial use. The 4 D stands for dumb, dangerous, difficult, and different. And I always get some people ask me about dumb, that dumb's a negative word. We're looking at the lens here of a system. We're not looking at the lens of a human. If I was to use the correct word or the academic word, I would use the word dumbfounded. But how often do you hear a worker say, I am dumbfounded by the current hazardous situation that I'm facing? That doesn't happen. They'll say things like the system's shit. I'm not getting supported. So we wanted language that could relate to people. So let's look at that. Dumb, we're asking that question about when you're doing some part of work or when you're working with a control, what doesn't make sense to you or what frustrates you? That the dangerous column, we're having that conversation about when you're doing something in there, what is risky or what feels challenging to you? When looking at that difficult column, we're We're trying to understand what is unusual or demanding that's being placed on you. And different is either those changing or surprising situations. The 4Ds identifies both physical risks, chronic risks, and psychosocial risks. The frustration, the challenging, the demanding, and the surprising is the impact on workers around work. The sense-making, the risky, the difficult, and the changing element, that is the physical or the chronic component of that risk. And you can see here, that's why we believe we need to look at risk in a single lens, not through different lenses in that space. I'm going to play a little video giving you an example of the 4Ds in use. For those, hopefully most people have heard of a little organization called Linfox. Just want to share with you that they still have zero harm in their video. Okay, so from our point of view, it means there's still hope. So let me play that for you. John, let me know if there's no audio.
So what's dumb and what just doesn't make sense to you?
Our first 4D session was on container congestion, and within that we actually looked at container unloading, loading and congestion of pallets around the docks. So what didn't make sense for us and what we categorised as dumb during the process is that we actually used to run pallets from all the way down that end of the warehouse, which is about 150 metres, and we used to forklift them down to the other end of the warehouse where they actually needed to be put away. So it actually created a bit of a bottleneck on site where people were passing each other with twin-tine pallets, etc. So that's why we categorised it as D, dumb. So after the session that we had with the team, some really great ideas came out of that. So we actually went through a site risk assessment in the area to allow us to safely unpack those containers. We no longer run pallets from one end of the warehouse to the other. We've decreased congestion through the warehouse. We're not moving pallets. And we also have removed some of those labour hours of someone sitting on a forklift back and forth running pallets all day. For us, it's been a bit of a game changer. I mean, that container unpack process, we've been doing that for, I think, 2 to 3 years in that area. We've had people coming up with different ideas, how we can improve things, looking for different risk assessments that we should do in the areas. So it has been really positive to see the engagement from the team following that.
Okay. Once again, that link will be made available to you. It's in a slide pack, so you can play that yourself. But what I'd like to explore is its broader use.
Brent, can I just
Sure.
interrupt you? Somebody just asked, was there a link to the video? And I think you put it up on the slide before, right?
Correct, and everyone will be able to access that video. Okay, the extended version is actually on the Linfox website, and I understand from Francois that they'll be dropping their 4Ds video in the next week or two as well through the Business Leaders Forum. So there's more stuff coming out. Okay, but what was really interesting is that there were 3 things that came from that session. The first of all, it doesn't matter what the D was. In that session, it could have fitted the dangerous, it could have fitted the difficult, it could have fitted the different as well. It's not the D that matters. It's because all of us have a different risk appetite. We have a different risk tolerance. And it's about creating that conversation. So if the worker saw it as dumb, that's the way they view it. But they could also see it as being risky as well. But here's where it gets interesting, because there were 3 different things that came from that. There were some wins that came from a risk point of view. There were some wins that came from an operations perspective, and there were some wins that came from a worker engagement, participation, and representation. I'd just like to explore those. So from a risk point of view, people comfortable that mobile equipment and workers are sticky, stuff that can kill you. So the change in that work design led to less exposure. Now, I could physically calculate that. In actual fact, the number that came back was there was now a 70% less exposure rate. But the problem here is you only need one forklift and one worker for a sticky. So that 70% wasn't really relevant. And that's why safety is hard to measure, particularly with high risk, those critical risks. But if we explore the operational wins, we had more freight movements. We had less labour hours. We had less emissions coming from the forklifts. We had lower running costs. Those 4 things can be directly measured. And those 4 things really interest operational management. You know, in the work that we do, we always find leaders are willing, workers are willing, and I think you use the word, John, it's the permafrost in the center that we need to melt. We believe that permafrost gets best melted through operational improvements. So that 4D session actually created better work. Now, what's interesting, did you hear that they've been doing that for years? And the fact is, do you think those workers had raised it before? 100%, but no one had taken them seriously. So when we looked at it from a worker engagement point of view, what we found is that workers were being listened to. And they were either having or gaining a voice. Through that 4Ds, they were able to change, they were able to challenge the old ways. They were able to suggest or validate better and safer ways of doing things. And they were recognized as the knowledge holder, and they were being respected. Now, I don't know how you guys feel, but I call that, is that psychological safety? Okay.
Sounds like it to me, Brent.
100%. In actual fact, Lynn Fox, when they first started doing it, they couldn't keep up with what they were being told by the workers. And the other subtle thing that was in that video, where she talked about that workers now want to do more risk assessments. When did that last ever happen? That workers came to you and said, can we run a risk assessment in our area?
Brent, I've never found a turkey that votes for Christmas.
That's right. You want to need the chicken or the pig. So the interesting thing there is it shifted that dynamic from doing safety to people or doing safety for people. It shifted it to doing safety with people and by people. And Lynn Fox have made huge gains in operational improvement. And an outcome of that basically has been better work, which has actually led to better safety. Do they still have accidents? The answer is yes. Okay. If you have grounds that are uneven, if you have things that have a sharp corner, make sense? That's the stuff's never going to change that. But most of the work that we see, the big changes are in the serious harms, because that's what the work design does. So the 4Ds is about shifting that lens. It's about shifting that lens by being able to understand not only whether our current controls, mitigations, and barriers work, but more importantly, what we call the uncertainty that the workers face between our safety systems and them having to do normal work. And on my Lego blocks, those little things are called landmines.
Hey, Brent, just let you know, you didn't turn the slides back on, I think, so we can't see a Lego box.
That is really.
I'm imagining.
It's error in action. That is error in action. So that box is basically showing there that the 4Ds can let you know if your controls, mitigations, and barriers can actually work. But more importantly, it can give you the insights to the uncertainty that workers face when they do those normal work. And the way that we do that is we shift the focus. So at the moment, a lot of the organizational focus is around symptoms and behaviors and outcomes. So when you go out and audit, you're auditing against the system to how the work is performing. And you're correcting the worker back to the system. What the 4Ds is doing is the 4Ds is understanding about the conditions that exist, because it's those conditions that are driving those behaviors that then drive the outcomes. And if we can make visible those conditions, it allows us to go back and change the work design, which is what Linfox did. They changed the work design. And that had an immediate impact on symptoms and behaviors. This same notion of system design and conditions is very much what the ISO 45003 or the Australian regs around psychosocial harm are saying. They're saying start with work design. If you can't change work, change the conditions in which work is done. If you can't change the conditions in work is done, improve worker engagement. If you can't improve worker engagement, then provide safer tools. Our work is all in that human component around that. And that's what creates that difference, and it's that dynamic that does that in that way. So in a practical sense, how could we do those things? If we can explore this one. So when we think, if we go back to the start of work and the end of work, 4Ds can be incorporated into your start of work. 4Ds can exist during that work. So for instance, if you were to have a different mechanism of auditing, you could use the 4Ds. The example I would use would be, you could see a piece of equipment with a guard removed. A 4Ds, rather than saying, why is the guard missing? Our language would be, how was the guard interfering with your normal work? So if you ask someone, why is the guard missing? They're automatically going on the defense, because you're focusing on a symptom or a behavior. If we ask the question, how's the guard interfering with normal work? We're focusing on the condition that exists in that work.
So Brent, I think that's quite interesting. So based on your comments there, is it that if we're running learning type engagements like this, that the way that we ask the questions and the way that we phrase them is quite important? And
yeah, system focused, not person focused.
Yeah. So what's the guidance around the way that we question doing this? Have you got any tips?
What I do with the 4Ds. The 4Ds is what we really tried to do.
Right.
Okay. So the first thing is the guard's not, the guard's been removed. So, so when you're using that angle grinder, share me a story when it doesn't make sense, when it's risky, when it's difficult, when it's different. And even if they said to you, I removed the guard because I can't cut it without the guard being present, then that's a really good conversation about why we're giving people the wrong equipment. But if we start with this notion, if we go back to it, we're treating that person having made an error of judgment, and we're treating them that they're the action or the cause of that. Where in actual fact, the learning lens is to understand about what conditions existed. That's what can come out of that in that space. Another thing, John, even if they did do it knowingly, the fact is you've actually got a really good engagement process that can now happen, because they're actually open to talk about it rather than having to defend their decision making in that space. So the 4Ds, what we talk about in normal work, there's 5 things where it can be helpful. One is actually describing and defining what good work practice looks like. So there'll always be a gap between work as imagined and work as done. What I find interesting that when accidents happen, there is normally quite a big gap between work as imagined and work as done. When we run a learning team, we call it a triangle, and that triangle is made up of work as imagined, normal work, and work on the day of the event. And surprisingly, there's not a huge difference between normal work and work on the day of the event. And workers are performing normal work because that's what they believe how things operate. So going into that learning team, I'm not sitting there telling them that they should be working this way, because what I'm trying to understand is how did that system degrade? How did that work change over time so it was no longer supporting people? So the 4Ds is great to understand good work practice, what good work looks like. It's great to identify those rubs and frictions that exist in work, because no work will be friction free. Okay, there's always rubs and frictions in work. What we also like is that the 4Ds can look at your controls. And I'm using a fancy risk term called control efficacy. Okay, what does that mean? It basically means if the control and processes for safe work are present, workable, and sufficient. The next component is the 4Ds can show you about your system fidelity, meaning, is the system for work, is it present? Is it doable? Is it relatable? Is it achievable? And can it adapt to change? So many systems, we talk about PDCA. Many systems don't do change management well. Systems by their nature struggle to listen. And then the fifth part, which we believe is equally as important, is the psychosocial impact of work. So this is how the design of work or the conditions of work are physically impacting humans, creating those goal conflicts and undue demand. I was with an organization recently where a manager observed a worker climb over an interlock gate to get to the machine. And their first response was about, the bad choices they were making. Our conversation were one about sense making. And what we found out is that machine jams about 5 times a day. And if you actually use the interlock, it had a knock-on effect down the other end of the machine, and it affected both the production and the quality of the product coming out at the end. And these guys took a lot of pride in their work. They did not believe that they were exposing themselves to a risk by doing what they did, but the interlock had frustrated them.
Brent, I mean, what came up again was linked to my question about questions.
Yes.
Was that whole point around, I suppose, that somebody's leapt over a gate with an interlock, and I suppose what you're saying there is that the questions that were being asked is, why did you jump over the gate?
Yes.
Blah, 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 those kind of questions, which would be
actions and cause.
It would be my instinct. And I suppose then, so an example of a question that you would ask to get to that would be, why is it necessary to get over the gate? Would that be right? What sort of a question would lead?
How did the gate? Yeah. So if I think about the 4Ds, how did using that gate make your job difficult?
Yeah, right. Yep.
What did you find challenging about having to clear the jams? Yeah. So it's that whole sense-making component. But of course, the organization was unaware of the frequency of jams. And its response was, well, no one reported anything. And I would argue no one was listening to the workers. Because what we have observed, and there is evidence of this through some science papers, where work is fundamentally built around the ability of workers to problem solve, you will find low levels of reporting, because you're always problem solving. So for you to report, you have to acknowledge that you don't have the ability to problem solve. And then the second part, if you do report it, if you're not involved in the solution or the feedback loop, you never report again. I'm not saying get rid of reporting. I'm saying reporting is a blunt instrument in that case. So what that 4Ds did in that situation showed a practice or a ritual that had become normalized over years. Does that exist in other businesses? You betcha. Okay, all these things are there. So when we talk about the 4Ds, what we're trying to explore is that gap between workers imagined and workers done, all those things, these conversations coming from workers, they are giving us what we call weak signals. They are telling us about things in the system that are creating the rubs or frictions in that work. When a near miss happens, unsurprisingly, that signal became amplified. When an accident happens and harm happens, no surprising that the weak signal has become a strong signal. But the weak signal was always there. How often have you had it, something gone wrong, and workers have told you the 400 other times that it went wrong? Okay. The issue that we have in learning from normal work is how do we see those signals? Because there's a lot of it. Our proposition to you guys, things like the 4Ds, is the storytelling that tells us. It's what people say and it's how they say it. And in that, that's where you get to learn that. And this is where AI is really good, because AI has that great potential to take those conversations and to look for those patterns or clusters in that. A great example of that would be Mitchell Services were over last month with the Business Leaders Forum, and they talked about how they report information up to the board. And there are 3 pages. Page 1 is they represent the human reliability rate. So they've taken TRIFR and inversed it. So if you're harming X number of people per X number of hours, then you're not harming. So out of interest, they're running at 99.82% is where they're running at. The second report they produce is their critical control verifications. And they do about 5,000 verifications a month across their business. They use the 4Ds for that critical control verification, and they're running at 96%. Ironically, they don't believe they can get much higher. Now, but here's the rub. Organizations believe that no work should happen until those controls are in play and present, which is interesting. The last page they present to the board are the themes from the 4D conversations. And every month there's 20 or 30 different themes that come out from those worker engagements. And the board isn't interested in the different themes. The board is interested in knowing which themes are becoming constant, because they know that work is always going to adapt. They've got high reliability, they've got high presence of controls, and lots of adaptation going on. They want to know which of those signals is becoming steady. Now, that doesn't mean a precursor to harm, okay? You can't predict an accident, okay? We can't predict the future. Therefore, how can we predict an accident? But what they're saying, if we understand when those signals are becoming stronger, then that's our best time to actually go in and influence the context of the work, the conditions of the work, and the work design. And then you can see that because that signal will basically die down. And sadly, another signal will replace it, because that's what adaptation is. I know that's quite a foreign concept for people to think about it that way. But in reality, that's what organizations see. And part of that strategy is how leaders get involved in those frontline conversations. And so much of leadership has been focused around this notion of find and fix, that they believe if they find a problem that they have a duty to fix the problem. Fixes don't necessarily change things. They might have short-term gains, but they can create other issues. The model that we're asking people to think about is this concept of listen, learn from that listening, and then lead with that learning. Because not all things that come up can actually be improved. So I can think, we're doing a lot of work in violence and aggression. You can't change the presence of public. Okay, there are lots of things, there are lots of risks that are so complex, let alone the human complexity, that many of these things aren't fixable. So in the absence of fixing or creating those improvements, what we're then left with is better understanding. And that better understanding for the workers creates that resilient capacity that they need to be able to cope with that dynamic changing work. And that's what we are observing from this work that's being rolled out.
And Brent, that sounds to me a bit like the concept of just informed decision making, right?
Yeah.
You know, accepting there's an imperfect world, but at least then decisions can be better informed because of that information that's available.
Absolutely, because I mean, at the end of the day, we trust our front line to do a good job. Why should we change that trust? What we're focusing on is that whole notion of how can we, just as change happens in small increments, you know, the systems degrade in small chunks. What we're interested in doing is how to put change back in small chunks, because it's that small stuff that creates sustainable change.
Yeah, it sounds like that theory of incremental gain, right? You know.
Oh yeah, Deming, you know, Deming's come to 100 years. Yeah.
Yeah, I have a question that's come through, which I suppose a lot of the people in our audience, obviously from the construction sector, and one question that's probably in a few people's heads is, have you got any examples of 4Ds being used or applied on a sort of typical NZ construction project? Have you done any work in that space?
Yeah. So there's an American company who's just won a major award for these sort of 4Ds, and it's a company called S&B Construction. Now, they need to apologize. They're a small business. They've only got about, I think it's about 30,000 workers. So they just want to apologize that they're small. Okay. What they've done is they've integrated those things across the various parts of the business from pre-planning. But for them, the most valuable component they've been doing is what they call post-learning. So that whole notion that if we do something at the start of the work, we need to do something at the end of the work. And in that end of the work, that is where we find out how workers planned became workers that emerged, how it became workers done, and how we had to make do. And in the construction sector, you are making do every day.
Do you know, Brent, that sounds really similar to the, you know, the debriefing approach that emergency services use, right?
Yes. Yeah. But it's all worker-led. And it's a whole notion, what the organization is interested in knowing in the making do are the themes, because that making do is the weak signal. So an example we've created, John, we created a little magnetic roll-up whiteboard that would go on the ute, you know, the bonnet of a ute. And that whiteboard was made up of 4 parts. One part talked about site, one part talked about task, one part talked about equipment, one part talked about protection and people. And we handed the workers a chalk marker and we stepped away. And that work group went around those 4 components talking about work for the day. what was really interesting is that when they then looked at that, they started to point out the interrelationships or the codependencies between those things. So the fact that we couldn't do that bit on the site until this part of this happened, we couldn't do that until that happened. That discussion can't happen in a linear flow like a JSA. That communication happens amongst people. And what we found is that that discussion with the 4Ds has shifted those workers from simply evaluating or assessing their work to actually appraising their work. What does that mean? Appraisal means that a worker can see how they work in the system, not how the system is imposed on them. When we're evaluating or assessing, we're imposing a system on them. That's probably been the biggest change for that company. And I won't use the word, well, everyone uses the word empowerment, okay? And you can tell the look on my face that it's bullshit, okay? But what it's done for the workers, it's given them autonomy. And because they've got autonomy, they actually now feel empowered to stop work. So rather than being given permission to stop work, they've actually realized the value in stopping work because they can see how they work in the system, not how the system is being imposed on them. That was a huge shift for them. The other benefits they found from this, they identified so much waste in their system. And that's really changed how they do things now. And they've got these feedback loops now going back to the procurement side of the business as well. Because the 4Ds identifies waste. The 4Ds identifies things that the workers value, things the workers don't value, we call that compliance, and the waste.
Can I ask you a question about, if you like, the dark side of reality of any safety intervention, and particularly thinking about this approach? Like, we know that things don't go perfectly, and like these things are quite hard to plug into businesses. So in that sense, you know, are there any tips or insights that you could give us that are on this call, like around tips and tricks to start implementing or using this approach? What are the pitfalls and what are the things that are really hard that don't often go well?
Yeah, so that's a great question. First of all, this is not transformation. Okay, we call this the Trojan mouse. And the Trojan mouse is going in and doing little micro experiments with the front line, the people that face the risk every day. And here's the best part. If you micro experiment and nothing's gained from it, you can bury that. If you micro experiment and there's huge value being gained from that, you can then share that. And the reason we call it the Trojan mouse, the one thing mice are good at doing is creating infestations. Okay, they love to breed. And the whole notion is that if we focus on the things that work, the things that both the organization finds value, the thing that workers value, then that starts to go wide. But absolutely, this is not transformation. Don't run a frigging campaign. Don't do any of those things. Just start with that. And John, it could be that you simply start with it doing critical control verification. It could be that you start doing it as part of a pre-start. You know, there are lots of ways of starting it.
So is this really about saying that actually you can start off quite small with this, find somewhere where it's maybe easier to do, where people are already open to maybe experimenting with different perspective or concepts, do that there and let it grow in its own natural way? Is that?
Yeah. Look, so it's interesting. Workers love to get involved. We've never had a problem. And we've done some very bad type situations that we've been asked to come in and they engage with us. A good example was we had an organization and they wanted their frontline supervisors to do the 4Ds conversations. So we got all those supervisors together And we said, what we want to do is we want to create some space for learning. And we use this tool called the 4Ds to work out what to get rid of in your job to create space for learning. And the first response from the supervisors, what do you mean get rid of? We get stuff piled on us. No one takes stuff away. So we said, no, we want you to tell us what you don't think adds value, and the organization will get rid of that to create space. The group did that, okay? And then they said to us, so what is it you want us to do? And we said the 4Ds. That was it. They'd already been trained. Makes sense? So them doing it themselves, they already realized the benefit and they rolled out. Now, for some people, some of those people struggled to listen because they were used very much a command and control environment. Others went to it quite quickly. That's straightforward. But what's been interesting is then over that 6-month period, everyone's come on board. And that organization has just done its latest survey, and it asks really hard questions such as, does this organization listen to you, learn from that, and do you feel valued in the feedback loop? And that was an 88% yes.
So Brent, we're coming to the end of our time, and like most people would probably have eaten their lunch while watching this, no doubt. So I suppose the final question is just, if people want to learn more, they want to do this, are there any sort of resources people can get hold of, anybody that we can speak to?
Yeah, so on our website, Learning Teams Community, we'll put that in the thing. You can download our leader-led thing is download for free, all that stuff. If you want to get into the background of it, on amazon.com.au is our 4Ds book as well. But the reality is there's lots of content that we make available. There's all the videos. And all we say is give it a go. What's the worst that can happen?
Oh, that's perfect. Right, well, we'll wrap up there, Brent. We've hit the 1 o'clock. Really appreciate you spending some time with us all. We had hundreds of people dial in who are now going off to do something else. So really appreciate that. And we'll get this on the website as soon as possible. Thanks, Brent.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Take care.